diplomats around the world, as well as people on both sides of the Middle East conflict. They are watching the U.S. very closely today. Both Israeli and Palestinian officials are denouncing yesterday's atrocity, but not all are sympathetic with American victims. More now from CNN's Jerusalem Bureau Chief Mike Hanna.
Intense security around the U.S. Embassy in Israel, and residents in a region that suffered incessant violence watch closely the unfolding tragedy in the United States. As news of the attacks spread, in East Jerusalem and Nablus, some took to the streets in celebration. Isolated groups of Palestinians who view the U.S. as an enemy because of its perceived support for Israel. But radical Palestinian groups denied any involvement in the planning or execution of the tragic events, and Palestinian leaders condemned the attacks in the strongest of terms, offering the deepest commiserations to the American people.
It is very difficult for me personally, for anyone, to speak about what had happened. It is not only against the Americans. It is not only against the American people or against the American government. It is against the whole international human being.
Condemnation and commiseration, too, from the Israeli government.
In this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people. Our hearts are with you, and we are ready to provide any assistance at any time.
Several hours after the attacks, Israel announced it was closing its airspace to all international flights, apart from its own El Al airline. In addition, Israel has closed all land crossings into neighboring countries. This not in response to any specific threats, say security sources, but a general tightening of already intense security. Mike Hanna, CNN, Jerusalem.
A diverse reaction out of the Middle East. Right now we go to Ms. Hanan Ashrawi. She is a Palestinian spokesperson. Good morning, Ms. Ashrawi. I'd just like to get your reaction.
Good morning.
To what is now being characterized as the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil.
It certainly is. I think it's the worst terrorist attack in the history of humanity, and it's a blow to humanity as a whole. It's a crime that is of just absolute immorality and evil. And may I take this opportunity to extend on behalf of the Palestinian people and the Arabs as a whole, our deep sense of grief, our, I don't know how to say it, our condolences to the American people and our identification with their pain and with their sorrow. This is entirely unconscionable. This is something that has struck deep in the hearts and minds of every human being, every person who recognizes the need for a moral imperative and for a human identification. And to the victims, their families, their friends, to the American people as a whole, we stand with you and by you, and we feel your pain.
An axe struck deep indeed, as every American feels this morning, and yet right now I'm going to show our domestic audience here, our audience actually worldwide, these pictures out of Ramallah yesterday. As you say these words, how do you account for these Palestinians who are dancing in the streets celebrating this attack against the United States?
I think this is entirely misleading. I know before people understood the implications or what was happening, they didn't understand. Some people reacted, and they're a minority. Children, people who didn't understand. Once people understood the magnitude and understood what actually did happen, I know from the people I saw, I spoke to, from the leadership, from President Arafat on down, to civil society, to people in the street, to the leadership of the Intifada, they all expressed horror, they all expressed condemnation, they all expressed grief. But you cannot sort of choose a minority and a moment in which people didn't understand in order to malign the majority or to color the Palestinian people in a to label them in a way which is entirely unfair and unjust. People felt maybe this was a political thing. They didn't know that this was an act of terrorism. And once people understood, they were unanimous in their condemnation, in their sorrow, and in their shock. I've heard this personally myself. I've talked to many people, and I really would appreciate it if you wouldn't choose the initial response and the minority response in order to generalize. This has been exploited enough to malign the Palestinians and to put us as though we are condoning this act, even though we as victims ourselves, we feel nothing but sympathy to the American victims and to humanity as a whole. We feel that we have a common bond. We are being shelled and killed daily. We are living in a state of siege. Last night, 11 Palestinians were shot and killed, shelled to bits and pieces. Over 100 are wounded. Ambulances cannot get to them. So even from the depth of our own sorrow and victimization, we reach out in genuine identification to the American people, and we say, we feel your pain, we feel your sorrow, and we will do everything possible, if can, to join you in attempting to combat such an evil that is an evil against everything that is human and moral, against everybody who's struggling for freedom, for dignity, for human rights.
Ms. Ashrawi, it is very possible that more American lives have been lost in this terrorist attack, in this tragedy, than even the countless number of Arab lives, even in the last 5 years. How is this tragedy likely to change the dynamic on the ground in the Middle East now?
I think this tragedy, even though we don't measure human lives quantitatively, every single life is important, is unique, and is irreplaceable. But I think this tragedy has changed the course of human history. I think the full implications will not be understood immediately. It has to be, the situation has to be studied, depending also on the perpetrators that must be found and must be held accountable and must be punished. I believe that it will have implications for global perceptions and definitions of who's an enemy and who's a friend. Such an invisible enemy that can strike anywhere, and with such professionalism, with such deliberation, having so many resources and capabilities. This is astounding. It is absolutely horrific, and it changes the dynamic of human relations and, of course, enmities and friendships and alliances beyond national boundaries. This has to be a collective human endeavor. And I think it should also give us an added impetus, particularly in the Middle East, to solve these problems, to solve our conflicts, to end an occupation, to try to create a situation where we can join forces against evil rather than constantly be parts of a perpetual cycle of victimization.
Ms. Ashrawi, that's
this
exactly.
has to give us greater energy and commitment.
Absolutely. That is exactly what the Bush administration will be asking for today around the world. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Hanan Ashrawi, spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority. Vince?
Well, it is 8 minutes before the hour of 7 a.m. Eastern Time in New York City, the morning after. We have more pictures to offer you as rescue workers continue to work furiously, hoping against hope to find survivors of Tuesday's terrible ordeal. We also understand that former President Bill Clinton is in Australia, and we are able now to give to you his reaction to yesterday's turn of events.
We are grieving with and supporting the families affected, and secondly, we're not going to let it beat us. We're going to rebuild, and we're going to go on, and we're not going to look the other way. And like I said, the country, I thought, was very well represented, our values, our ideals, and our interests by what the President said last night. I thought it was an excellent statement, and I think all of us should support it.
Have you spoken to the President?
Again now, President Bill Clinton responding to what happened, and we want to show you again, this is morning now in Manhattan, Ground Zero, former site of where the World Trade Center once stood. And again, the fire's burning, and rescue workers, firefighters, police, emergency people on hand, and sifting through that horrible carnage.
Right. And reports this morning, Vince, that rescuers are hearing the voices of people who were trapped underneath the rubble. They have a sense that there are people alive, and reports on New York radio of people inside the rubble trapped and talking to rescuers, talking to family members on their cell phones as they wait and wonder if rescue will come in time. Fires are still burning in that rubble as we speak. You know, you talk about what the situation is on the ground, and you get a sense of people suffering and the tragedy and the panic yesterday. CNN's Deborah Fayrick takes a look at the victims, and in particular, the firefighters lost.
Many of the 300 firefighters missing and feared dead were believed to be inside the World Trade Center when it collapsed.
I can't find anybody from 5 rescues and 7 squads, and it's just it's a devastating thing. I don't know. Well, the fire department will recover, but I don't know how.
Arriving first on scene, they ran into the burning towers, carrying hoses and trying to get people to safety.
The horror of it all was all the first alarm, second alarm, third alarm, fifth alarm companies. They were all in there. And there's a lot of companies that wiped out from what I understand.
Fire engines were crushed, a strategic command center silenced, and several of the highest-ranking fire officials buried beneath tons of dust and steel.
I don't know what to say. We lost people that have given over 40 years.
Those who got out in time went back, injuries and all, to search for their friends. Others off duty grabbed their gear and raced to help dig out any possible survivors.
My brother works in the 91st floor. My brother, and he's unaccounted for at this time. So I'm just, doing a lot of praying.
Praying amidst an unnatural silence.
That's probably what amazed me the most. There was no people to be seen. Even the dogs couldn't find people.
At firehouses in Manhattan, there were flowers and mourning as everyone waited, holding out hope.
They should have been here already. The rig is not back. They're not back. They should have been back.
More than 30 police officers also died. Choking back tears, several firefighters summed up the catastrophe.
These are your buddies.
We lost a lot of friends today. A lot of friends.
A loss that will be shared by all New Yorkers. Deborah Fayrick, CNN, New York.
Vince, we've got a wide shot which gives the context and the perspective of the damage of the World Trade Center, which no longer exists now. Those twin towers crushed. That is the rubble that you're seeing between apartment buildings and high-rises which remain in the surrounding area as the rescue efforts still go on.
You know, as we look at this, I can't help but think this is not somewhere else in the world. This is New York City, USA. And we are seeing this on our soil, on our turf. And it's still difficult to digest almost a day later.
As we watch the sun rise over this devastation, knowing that there are likely still people alive, as we've been hearing this morning, rescue workers are saying that they do hear voices underneath that rubble as they try to get to people on time. They still have no idea how many people are trapped, how many people killed, but they are very sure that it is in the thousands. This is obviously the heart of the financial center of the world, and in Washington, the devastation to the central military operation in the United States, the Pentagon, if we can take that live picture, if we have it available, still fires, Vince, burning there this morning.
You can see some of the damage. If you can have that Pentagon live shot, you see some of the damage there as well, and there it is. As firefighters still working, and as you mentioned, Carol, fire still burning there, and just a chunk of those of that ring, of the rings that surround the Pentagon, taken away. Carol.
5 stories there and several stories underneath, and this jet plane plowing into, as you said, the inner circle of the Pentagon, this military complex. And we will be obviously covering this throughout the day. 800 people, they think, died at the Pentagon alone, but still counting the devastation and the damage there. We leave you now this morning as our coverage continues, remembering the victims of this tragic terrorist attack.